Hi everybody, my name is Hannah, this is Pepper and Pine, and I have a tutorial to share with you today. We are going to be making these knitting needles with mushroom tops made from polymer clay. So the first thing you're going to need are some hardwood dowels. These are a 1/4-inch dowel, but they're not my favorite ones. You can find in the description box a better alternative. I'm also using some acrylic paint, and we're going to need some sandpaper in order to sand our dowels down. And I have some of different kinds so that we have a smooth and then a more rough kind. I'm also using this walnut stain in order to stain our dowels. You can also use these Lyra opaque watercolor paints. And I also have my distress inks, which I've used on a recent project for another set of knitting needles, and I really like those ones. Okay, so we're going to be using these 1/4-inch wood dowels in order to make our knitting needles. These measure 12 inches long, but I'm actually going to cut them down so that they are a little bit smaller. So I'm going to make these 9 inches. I also make another set that's 10 inches. And this size wood dowel is great for bulky weight yarn, especially for a new knitter or a young child who's just learning how to knit. I just have this little handsaw here that I'm going to use in order to trim my dowels. They're really easy to cut. You could probably even use a pair of scissors, but I think that it would damage it a little bit. And then you can just snap it off once you get about halfway through. Next, we want to sharpen the end to a dull point. Now I'm just using this little hand sharpener here, but I actually used my electric sharpener for most of them. And once they're done, you can see that these two on the right are the appropriate type of point, but these other ones are too pointy. We don't want them that pointy. So now we're going to need to sand these down, and you have to keep sanding and sanding and sanding because you do not want any little rough spots that will snag while you're knitting, and it's going to be very frustrating. So not only do you want to sand this down so that it's smooth, not just on the point, but on the entire dowel, but you also want to make sure that you've sanded down the tip so that it is an appropriate size and shape. So we want it to be quite rounded, and we want the tip to be somewhat soft, not pointy. So maybe soft isn't the right word, but we definitely don't want it pointy. Otherwise, once you start knitting, it's going to hurt your fingertips if you've got a really sharp needle, and also it's going to maybe split your yarn. So you want it to be a nice rounded top, and you want it to be really smooth. Next, we want to make sure that our dowels themselves are really smooth as well. I'm starting out with a rough sandpaper, but then I'll move to a smoother sandpaper to make sure that they're really smooth. But if you're going to paint or stain them, then you're going to need to repeat the process after your stain has completely dried, or rather after the dowel is completely dried, because when you add wetness to your wood, it's going to expand and it's going to swell a little bit, so you want to make sure that you sand it back down so it's nice and smooth. Next, we're going to use a little bit of walnut stain in order to stain our dowels. You don't need to do this. It's totally optional. Most of the ones that I've done in the past don't have any stain, but I do like the way this turned out. Now, I watered down that walnut stain a little bit, but it's awfully light, so I'm actually going to go back in and stain it again just with straight, full strength walnut stain. But the other thing is that once they are completely dry and you sand them, they're going to lighten a little bit because you are taking off some of that color. But then once you put the wax or a sealant on them after you're done, you're going to end up bringing some of that color back out again. So you can see that they're pretty well stained, but we're going to actually make them darker. But first, we're going to sand them down. And as you see me sanding them, you're going to see that they're going to get lighter and lighter. But if you stopped here and you added your wax at this point, you would then bring out some of that color. But we're going to go ahead and make them darker. And this time, I'm not going to dilute the wood stain, or the walnut stain rather. I'm just going to use it full strength, and I'm just going to paint these on, just using a regular paintbrush with a medium tip, so not too full, and if it's too pointy, then it's just going to take really long to paint your dowels. I'm going to put them in this little beaker here so that they can dry completely. And then in the meantime, we're going to work on the tops of our knitting needles. You can use little wood beads, but in this case, I want to try out using some of my oven baked clay. I really like this oven baked clay. It's super soft, which makes it really easy to work with if you're working with young children, and it molds very easily. And I like that it comes white because then you can paint it whatever color you want, and it holds up to acrylic paints really well. So I love this product so much. I used to buy polymer clay in all different colors, but I found that if we didn't use them right away, they got really hard and difficult to use. And anyway, they're much harder than this oven baked clay, even when they're brand new and they're already in different colors. So I didn't find them as usable in our educational environment in our homeschool as this clay. So this has become my go-to clay. So I got them into a nice round ball, and I am just fitting them over the top of our dowels to see if it's going to be the right shape and the right size. And I actually want them to be a little bit smaller. So I took them off and I reshaped them. And what's great about making them little mushroom tops is that they don't have to be perfectly round. In fact, they should be a little bit deformed, and well, not deformed actually. They just shouldn't be round. And each one can be slightly different as long as they're roughly the same size. All right, so you don't want to make your hole too big, but you do want it the right size. It may shrink just a touch in the oven, but in general, it does hold its shape and size. You don't want it too small, otherwise you definitely won't be able to get your dowel in, but a little bit too big is no problem. You can always just add extra glue. So we're going to stick it in the oven. I'm doing this at 200 degrees for 20 minutes. You don't want to bake it at too high a temperature. You will burn and brown them. So 20 minutes later, we're going to take them out of the oven. We do need to make sure they cool all the way before we paint them. And I will be using an acrylic paint. I don't know much about the different varieties of acrylic paint, but this one worked just fine. In fact, you can find the links to all of the materials that we used on the blog post that accompanies this video. That link is down in the description box below. So I'm going to use this beautiful red to paint our little mushrooms. And I'm going to stick it on this extra dowel here just so that I've got some ability to work with it, because I didn't want to glue them on just yet because our dowels are still drying and I wanted to give them another coat of stain. So I'm going to let these dry, and I actually put another coat of paint on, which I actually regret because it made it a little bit sticky at the end. So one coat would have been just fine. I love this beautiful, brilliant red. It's so gorgeous. Next, I'm going to take a little bit of white in order to make the details on the mushroom. I'm using a smaller paintbrush and I'm just dabbing it on. Now, this doesn't have to be exactly right. It can just reflect what that kind of mushroom looks like, but you can definitely pull out a nature book and try to mimic it a little bit more accurately. Okay, so back to our dowels. They are dry but rough, so we do want to sand them. I've got some 220 sandpaper here, and I'm going to be sanding them so much that you're actually going to see a fine dust appear on my desk. We want to make sure at this point that they are as sanded as they're going to be before you add wax or sealant to it, because once you do that, you won't be able to easily sand them. So you want to make sure that they are just right before you add your wax. And at this point, I decide to give it one more coat of stain, although to be honest, I think I should have just stopped there, but I went ahead and I gave them one more coat, which means that once they dry, I need to make sure that I sand them one more time. So you'll have to sand them between each set, or rather, you don't actually have to sand them each time, but every time you're done adding more stain or paint, you want to make sure that you sand them just to make sure they're nice and smooth. I've got a little piece of Stockmar wax here, and I'm going to rub it onto the dowel. It is a warm day, but I'm also going to use the heat of my hand just to warm it up, melt it a little bit, and kind of rub it into the dowel. And this is going to make a nice smooth finish that the yarn should hopefully glide right across really easily. You can also see that it does develop the color a little bit when you add wax or a sealant to it. You can kind of see the difference between the two dowels here, one with the wax and one without, and now they both have the wax and they are ready for their little mushroom top. I'm using my hot glue gun to affix my mushrooms. You could use a wood glue, but I love the hot glue gun. I find it to be a really durable a solution for glue, and it dries really, or rather cools really quickly, which means that in no time your projects are done. And the durability part is really important for this. You don't want to be losing your mushrooms, especially while you're knitting a project. All right, so here are both sets of knitting needles. The one on the left, it has the lighter stain on the dowels, and the one on the right rather has the darker stain, and you can see that they're a little bit shorter. So ones on the left are longer and lighter stain, ones on the right are shorter with a darker stain, and they both have that waxy finish. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to see some of our other Waldorf-inspired tutorials, you can tap on the screen right now. Don't forget to check out the blog post that accompanies this video for more information. You can find that link down in the description box below. And if you want to see how our homeschool is progressing on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram at Pepper and Pine.